This is Rebecca Kling with the National Center for Transgender Equality. We are recording today on Wednesday, March 1st at about noon. And this is a training around advocating for and with trans youth, particularly in school. For those of you who I haven't had a chance to connect with before, I am the community storytelling advocate at NCTE, and I work with trans folks and allies around the country to help get out stories that support trans rights. And a little bit about myself, before joining the NCTE staff, was a artist and educator, so I did performance work about my own trans identity as well as educational workshops about trans identity more broadly. And I work a lot with young people. In particular, I'm on the leadership team with Camp Aranutic, which is a camp for trans and gender variant youth that this upcoming summer will be my 6th summer working with them. So I'm always excited to find opportunities to support trans youth around the country. Answering a couple questions. I will be sending the slides later as well as the video, so people will have the raw deck to follow along with as well. And our agenda for today, we're going to go a little bit on what research and what messaging background is going into this training, some updates on recent news, a little bit on how to share your story and how to conduct yourself in interviews, and that's something that I also do a much longer webinar on. And then we'll get into some specifics around how to advocate in schools as well as the state level, and then where do we go from here. As a disclaimer, we want you to use this information. We also want to remind you you're speaking on your own behalf. So right now, we don't have an NCTE Speakers Bureau or an NCTE satellite group. So that's something we're certainly interested and open to if it feels like would be useful to y'all. And then some fine print jokes, including what did the duck say when it bought lipstick? Put it on my bill. All right. So a little bit about messaging and about how and why we talk about things the way we do. And the first big thing there to think about is who is your audience? And a lot of organizations these days, in particular the Movement Advancement Project MAP and the Center for American Progress has done a lot of work about this, is thinking about there are those folks who might be on this call or who might be friends or family or teachers or peers who are really in our camp. They are supporting trans rights, and there is probably nothing we could do that would make them not support trans rights. I'm really fortunate to count my parents in that group, that they support me, they support trans rights, and all of the messaging and all of the nasty ads they see on TV are going to not convince them to stop supporting trans rights. And on the other end, we have people who are opposed to trans rights. Now, we definitely want to get to this group eventually, but we're probably not going to reach them tomorrow, probably not next week, maybe not even in the next 2 years or 4 years. And so what we want to think about is then who is that movable middle? These are folks who have the potential to be allies and also have the potential to be moved into our opponent's camp. And these are people who, when we initially talk to them, they want to support LGBT people, and they want to support trans people as well. If you ask, should you be able to be fired for being gay, or should you be able to be kicked out of school for being trans, they would say, no, of course not, you shouldn't be. They think that discrimination is wrong, and that they want to be good people and do the right thing. But when we go a little deeper with this population, with the movable middle, we learn that they haven't thought a ton about LGBT rights, and they've thought very, very little about trans people in particular. And so this group will have contradictory expectations. And what I mean by that is people in this group might say, well, of course you shouldn't be fired for being gay, but maybe if you hadn't been acting so gay, it wouldn't have been an issue. Or, of course trans students deserve a good education, but maybe if they weren't so flamboyant about it, it would be easier for everyone else. So you have these contradictions of, on the one hand, sure, be who you are, but on the other hand, I don't want to have to deal with it. This also is a group that projects the problems onto LGBT people. So they might say, well, if this person wasn't so loud about transitioning, they would have an easier time. And then they struggle with identifying and with empathizing. And that's where our stories can be really powerful, and that's where our voices as advocates can be really powerful. This population also tends to dismiss stories of harm. And what I mean by that is they might say, well, sure, it's bad that this one person was bullied, but that doesn't mean we need to change policies. Or sure, it's bad that that one person was fired, but that doesn't mean we need new laws. And this population particularly has concerns around trans people. So they have this very binary idea of gender. There's men over here and women over here. So gender nonconforming or gender queer or non-binary folks, this population, this movable middle, doesn't really understand what that means. And they also have a really stereotypical idea of who trans people are. They don't see us as members of community. They don't see us as students or as siblings or as doctors or nurses or teachers. They see us as, at best, maybe from the Fosters or from Modern Family or from Orange is the New Black, and at worst from something like Dallas Buyers Club or The Crying Game or Jerry Springer. And so we want to be able to say, no, trans people are full people that have complicated, nuanced lives and are members of community. They are members of families and schools and churches and businesses and all of that. And when we can reach this movable middle, we can win them over to join us as allies. Now, some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today is draining. And as someone who likes to bring in a little bit of lightness, even when there aren't space for jokes necessarily, although I guess I already told the duckbill joke, I try to put in some fun animal pictures just to make sure that we remember that there are cute things happening out in the world as well. So, getting into some news updates, and some of this is stuff that if those of you were able to join on the Facebook Live we did last week or have been following some of our blog and Facebook postings, I want to make sure everyone has the same information. So first I want to talk a little bit about Title IX. Title IX is this 1972 law that says educational institutions that receive federal funding cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. Now that's almost every educational institution, even private schools and private universities usually, although not always, get some federal funding. So Title IX applies to almost every school in the country. And it says you can't discriminate on sex. So that's if you have a boys team in sports, there also needs to be opportunities for girls to play sports. Title IX is also used to combat sexual assault and rape on campuses. And increasingly, courts are saying Title IX covers LGBT students. And what I mean by that is if you are discriminating against someone because of their sexuality, or you are discriminating against someone because they are trans, courts are saying that counts as sex discrimination. Because if I hadn't transitioned and things had been fine, but my transition to womanhood causes a problem for you, that falls under sex discrimination. And more courts are agreeing with this. In 2016, the Department of Ed under President Obama issued guidance saying, yes, Title IX covers LGBT people, and in particular, Title IX covers trans students. And so discriminating against transgender students, the Department of Ed was saying, counts as a Title IX violation. However, last week, the new Department of Ed under President Trump rescinded that guidance. They took away that guidance and said, it's up to the states to decide how or if trans people should be protected, and that Title IX, which was not written with trans people in mind, does not apply to trans people. Now, I want to be very clear. This does not change the law itself. Title IX still says the exact same thing. Sex discrimination in educational institutions that receive federal funding is illegal, full stop. And more courts are agreeing that that anti-discrimination law also includes LGBT people. However, it's now unclear how the Office of Civil Rights, which is a federal enforcement agency, will work on Title IX. So this is something that NCTE's position, other advocacy organizations' positions, and more court positions is that Title IX does cover trans people. But the Department of Education is saying that's not how they see it. We would say the Department of Education is wrong in this place. This overlaps with what people have been talking about around Gavin Grimm. Gavin is an amazing young man, a trans young man from Virginia, and he was using male bathrooms in school in Virginia, and they, a couple of years ago, prevented him. They said you can no longer use the boys' room. You have to go to private bathrooms or to the nurse's office. And Gavin, with the help of the ACLU and with a lot of other organizations, sued the school board and said, no, as a trans man or as a trans young man, I deserve to use the men's room, and not doing that is a violation of my rights under Title IX. There was a question, is anyone else experiencing sound connectivity issues? Ooh, I hope not. So Gavin's case has slowly made its way up, and there will be a hearing in the Supreme Court on March 28th. And we expect that there will be a ruling around that sometime in June. There were originally two questions that the court was considering. The first question was, should the court listen to what the Department of Education says? So the previous Department of Education under President Obama said Title IX applies to trans kids. Should courts defer to that when making decisions around this? That question is sort of no longer in play because the new Department of Education leadership has said Title IX no longer, in their view, applies to trans kids. However, the more important question is whether or not Title IX actually applies to trans youth. And that's still going to be discussed on March 28th, and we're still expecting a ruling sometime later this spring or early summer. Any questions on any of that? And I am gonna unmute everyone for a minute, and there's also the chat, and I really do apologize that some people are having sound issues. Any questions either on where Title IX stands right now or on Gavin Grimm's case? All right, I don't hear anyone chiming in. I don't see any text messages.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, sorry, my baby is right here too, so she's got a question. So my husband asked me recently what basic right is violated, and in the Gavin Grimm case when he was denied bathroom access, and I initially responded with the right to privacy, just because, you know, that you're involuntarily outed by being denied bathroom access, but he kind of fired back with, and he's very supportive, but just he's a lawyer, so he loves to play the devil's advocate. And he said, well, then should it be based on whether or not the person is out? So how can I respond to someone who asks me that same question? You know, what is that basic right that's being violated? I mean, obviously to me, it makes perfect sense, but I just want to be able to explain it.
That's a great question, and I want to connect with some of our policy folks to make sure I'm giving you a fully accurate legal answer. But in terms of Title IX specifically, Title IX is saying that sex discrimination is not okay, and that if you are saying to Gavin or to any transgender child, you have to use a different bathroom that is removed and separate from all of the other students, that is treating someone differently on the basis of their identity, in this case their trans identity, which we argue and courts are agreeing would fall under that sex discrimination. I want to not get into privacy rights, not because that's incorrect, but because I want to check with our policy folks to make sure that that is part of what we've been talking about in court. And there are a couple of questions from the chat room. Is it only a question because it did not specify trans? And I assume this is around Title IX. If Title IX was rewritten today to explicitly say discrimination is not okay around sex or sexual orientation or gender identity or gender expression, then absolutely, this wouldn't be a question. The confusion is because it just says sex discrimination, and courts and activists are saying LGBT rights fall under that because anti-LGBT discrimination is almost always around some form of sex discrimination, that this is an issue. And there was another question, do we think the recent case in Pennsylvania in favor of trans rights will help establishing more case law? So for those of you who didn't hear, there was a ruling earlier this week in Pennsylvania that supported the rights of, I believe, 3 trans young women to have appropriate access to facilities in their school. And again, as someone who's not a lawyer, I don't know how that would impact the Supreme Court ruling. I do know that all cases like this only help us, both in terms of establishing more case law and in terms of protecting students in those places. So now these students in Pennsylvania will be treated appropriately in that state. And I'm going to mute folks again and continue. But again, please continue to share questions. And if I can't answer them, or if I try to answer them and you still have questions, please let me know and I will follow up. So someone on the chat window is saying, in this case, does state law trump federal law? So again, one of the things that is frustratingly confusing is that federal law has not changed in the last week. Title IX still says exactly what it did a week ago and exactly what it did a year ago, that sex discrimination is illegal. However, what the Department of Education under Betsy DeVos said is, we, the Department of Ed, no longer consider LGBT to fall under that sex discrimination, and we are going to leave it to the states to figure out how to process that. So it's not saying that state law trumps federal law, it's saying that state law, that the Department of Education is stepping back from interpreting Title IX in this way so that states have a little more leeway. We, again, are saying that, no, actually they don't have any more leeway, that the Title IX still protects trans students. I want to give a little bit of info on sharing your stories and on speaking to media. And again, there's a lot more opportunity for this type of training that I get more time for, but I want to make sure that at least you all have a little bit around this. So when sharing your story, and this can be in a media conversation, this can be with other parents or other educators, this can be in legislative places, anytime you're sharing a story, the first thing I want you to think about is whose story are you sharing? And what I mean by that is, are you telling your story as a parent? Are you telling your child's story? Are you telling your community's story? And as you're thinking about whose story you're telling, thinking about, do I have permission to share that story? And in particular, how will other members of my family be impacted? So maybe you have a trans child who's totally okay with you sharing their story really publicly, but they have, a sibling who's not sure about sharing their story. So when you share that story, is everyone who's involved going to feel good about it and going to be okay with it? And this is something that I'm always happy to brainstorm, and I know there are a lot of parents and wonderful educators on this call who I'm sure also have great thoughts and experiences on how they've navigated this. And then what I would think about is how do you use your voice to elevate the voices of trans young people? That in particular, so giving a little bit of context, one of the hashtags and one of the chants around activism that's been happening for trans students is protect trans students. And there has been a response from some trans young people who are nevertheless teenagers and young adults who are saying, well, whoa, 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 stand with us. Don't protect us, but work with us to make sure that these protections apply. And so what I would also think about when you're getting ready to tell stories is making sure that you are speaking with trans folks, not necessarily speaking for trans folks. That we want to make sure when we're doing this advocacy, even if it's for trans young people who may not be comfortable speaking for themselves or may not be appropriate to speak, it may not be appropriate to put a 6-year-old in front of a rally crowd, but still making sure that you feel like that engagement is being done with the trans community rather than for the trans community. And then I would encourage you to ask yourself, why are you sharing your story and what do you want from your audience? And what I mean by that is we share stories for tons and tons of reasons, ranging from political change to personal catharsis and feeling good. And all of those are great. But if you are sharing a story with a family member about supporting trans people, that might be different than sharing it with a legislator, and that might be different than sharing it with a reporter. So I want you to think about, even if you're telling the same story, what do you want from that audience? And that could be really concrete. I need you, Senator so-and-so, to vote this way on this bill. Or I need you, reporter, to work to cover trans issues more accurately. There are an infinite number of reasons why you might be sharing your story and a ton of reasons what you might want from your audience. It's important to think about those questions before you get into it so you don't get 5 minutes into a story and go, wait, why am I sharing this? And then in terms of constructing the story itself, I would encourage, this is not the only way to share a story, but it helps with getting a lot of key points out of introducing yourself and making a connection to trans rights. So I'm Rebecca Kling, I'm a trans person. I'm so-and-so, I'm the parent of a trans person. I'm such and such, I have a student in my class who's trans. Or I'm so-and-so and I'm not trans, I'm a strong ally. So introducing yourself and explaining your connection to trans rights. That introduction is also a great place to define your terms. So if someone doesn't know what transgender is, or non-binary, or transition, that's a great place to explain what those terms mean. And I see a question in the chat, I'm going to circle to that in a second. Sharing your story itself, so thinking about, is this a compelling story? Have I rehearsed this story? Is this a story that's appropriate for this audience? And then thinking about that case for trans rights. So saying, that's why this is so important. So my story about being fired as a trans person is why trans rights and employment are so important. My child's story of being bullied is why trans protections in school are so important. And then the very last thing you're going to do, sort of the cherry on top is, this is why I need you to do blank. This is why I need my audience to vote or to stand up against bigotry or to make phone calls, whatever it is. And so you're introducing yourself and explaining your connection. You're sharing a story that's going to bring your audience in. You're linking that story to why trans rights are important. And you're ending with asking your audience to do something. Again, this is not the only way to share a story, but it's a helpful flow to remember because it works in a lot of different contexts. It works just as well as a PTA meeting as it does at a rally. All right, so there's a question in the chat. I'm not a lawyer. Interested in thoughts. If I recall, part of the argument in the Supreme Court ruling on marriage equality noted the confusion about different laws in different states. Is marriage from one state honored in another? It seems we're in the same situation here in respect to bathrooms and other trans issues, i.e. being able to use the bathroom in one state but illegal in another. So again, this is something that I want to follow with the lawyers. I want to follow up with the lawyers about what will be argued in court. But certainly from a moral standpoint, I absolutely agree with that my rights as a trans person or your child's rights as a student should not be different based on where they were born or where they happen to live. That a transgender student in North Carolina is entitled both morally and legally to the same protections under federal law as a transgender student in California. And I don't know, I'm going to ask that because I'm going to write that down because that's an interesting question in terms of how things will be argued in front of the court, but certainly that's something that we're mindful of in terms of why these different state protections are important, but at the end of the day, we also need strong federal protection. So I want to make a note, linking all right. So the next thing I'm going to talk about very briefly is how to conduct yourself in interviews. And again, there is no hard and fast rule here, but I want to make sure to give some tools. Some general things I would say, again, thinking about your audience. How are you going to speak differently to a PTA group than to a group that's just of students or just of educators? How are you going to speak differently to a reporter that you believe to be sympathetic? Maybe they've written other positive stories about trans students, than to a reporter who's never worked on trans issues at all. Being polite, even when you're interrupted and even when your opponent is being rude, always valuable, as is taking your time. And what I mean by this is, with very few exceptions, you have time to breathe. You have time to pause. You have time to say, I really want to think about that question. And so I would encourage you to know your own limits, and both in terms of where emotionally you're willing to go and what your area of expertise is, and be willing to say, I need a moment to think about that question, or even to say, that's great. I need to connect you with some folks at NCTE because I don't have an answer to that right now. And you'll see I've done that a couple times by bunting things over to our policy folks. Connect and redirect. And this is something that anyone who works with youth knows how to do. And this is something that's coming out of my experiences, in particular working with summer camp. So if I have a camper who is really not interested in the activity we're doing, I want to connect with that. Yeah, that sounds like it's really tough. And then I want to redirect. Isn't it so exciting that this thing happened? Or are you looking forward to the campfire tonight? Or tell me about what's going on in your bunk. So I'm going to connect with the concern and then steer the conversation to something that feels more positive and productive. And when we're talking about this with reporters or with media or with school officials, being able to validate a concern, so to say like, yeah, I understand that this might be something that parents are nervous about. And then how do you steer that? I want to really talk about my child and how they're going to be safe and protected. We never want to tell people that their fears are dumb or that their fears are unreasonable. Also thinking about knowing your level of expertise. And this I said earlier, let me follow up with you, or let me connect you with someone at NCTE or ACLU or HRC or any of the other organizations to give you that information, because I don't want to give you the wrong information. And then finally, sometimes you may need to wrap things up early. Hopefully this is not something you'll ever run into, but if you're speaking with a politician or a parent or a legislator or a reporter who just doesn't get it, and is either being unintentionally rude or actively mean, sometimes it's appropriate to say, you know, I really appreciate your time. I'm going to wrap things up and thank you for your time. Some things I would encourage avoiding, and there's no hard and fast rules here either, but in general I would say over-the-top language and name-calling hurts us more than it helps us. Now this could be things like swearing, or like calling someone a jerk, or calling someone nasty names. I would also say big sweeping statements. So things like, no one cares more about bathroom safety than trans people, or all trans people have experienced blank. Because we want to make sure that we're accurately capturing our whole community. And when we say things like nobody or everybody, we leave room for people to pick apart that tiny argument rather than dealing with the more important issue. I would also say, going back to, don't tell people that their anxieties are dumb or wrong or dismissive. And this is something that if someone is concerned about bathroom safety, if someone is concerned about locker room privacy, if someone is concerned about morality, those concerns are real to that person. And we want to try and find ways, again, to connect, and sometimes we need to redirect, but to not tell someone that their fears or their anxieties are wrong, because that's not helpful, it's not productive. And then being careful to think about movement comparisons. And this is something you'll sometimes hear people say, this is just like the civil rights movement, or trans rights are the new civil rights movement, or bathroom discrimination now is just like what black people experienced in Jim Crow. And there are a couple of reasons I would encourage you not to go there. First, we can't all make that argument in a way that's authentic. So as a white person, born in the North, in the mid-'80s, me making civil rights comparisons is not authentic. It's an inappropriate thing for me to do because it is speaking to experience I don't have, and it's speaking to a struggle that I'm not a part of. There are moments, for example, when former Attorney General Loretta Lynch spoke last year about trans rights, and she, as a black woman, was born in North Carolina, was able to really beautifully talk about connecting the struggles of the trans rights movement to the struggles of people of color. But that's because she could speak from experience and from her own story. And so I would say be very, very, very careful when making movement comparisons. It's not something I would generally recommend. And here's a giraffe, because giraffes are awesome and adorable and ridiculous. One of the things that can come up a lot in interviews that I want to talk about briefly is uncomfortable personal questions. And what I want you to think about is there are a couple of ways to answer these. And the way I would say to judge how to answer these is the context. In particular, does this person need this information, or are they just curious? And would it be okay to flip this question back around? and someone is asking, you ask us not to minimize bathroom anxieties. Can you give an example? And then someone says, what's a good response when you try to argue with bathroom safety? Absolutely. So a couple of things that you can think about when responding to bathroom safety. The first thing, again, is to validate that. Yes, we are all concerned about safety and privacy in bathrooms. I'm concerned about that as a trans person, or I'm concerned about that as a parent, or I'm concerned about that as a community member. We all want to make sure that people are safe and have a comfortable experience in bathrooms. That includes my trans child, or that includes me as a trans person. And so what I want to try and do, and I'm speaking now sort of as an example, what we want to try and do, you're bringing that person in, is find a way where everyone, including my trans child, can be safe in bathrooms and have a comfortable experience. And if you want to get into more detail, there are also some really great resources on our website that I will send as a follow-up where you can say, and if we talk to educators, they agree that supporting trans students also supports everyone else. Or if we look at sexual assault and domestic violence organizations, they overwhelmingly agree that supporting women and children goes hand in hand with supporting trans people. And so when we look at coming from law enforcement, when we look at coming from educators, when we look at coming from sexual assault and domestic violence groups, trans rights and protecting women and children go hand in hand. And that the concerns around safety or the concerns around privacy, those wanting to protect yourself and wanting to protect your children, absolutely 100% real. Wanting to do it at the expense of my trans child, and experts say it won't help anyway, that's not an okay solution. We absolutely want to work together to find a solution that fits for everyone, but kicking at my trans child out of the restroom isn't the way to do that. And I hope that helps a little bit. I'm also always happy to brainstorm offline or to get on phones and sort of talk about this more. So in terms of, isn't it true that there's never been an incident? So that's one of those things that, going back to those big sweeping statements, I would be real hesitant to say the word never. And I would be hesitant for two reasons. First, there may be something that happens tomorrow. And then we sort of have to rethink our messaging. If we've been saying there's never been an incident and tomorrow there's an incident, that opens us up to a really easy attack. Well, you said never and now this has happened. The other reason is that I would be hesitant to say never is because there are examples our opponents have come up with that they claim are trans people harassing women in bathrooms. Now, I would argue, and NCTE and most activists would say, those either weren't trans people, they were people who were claiming to be trans to make a stink and sort of prove a point, or there are still reasons that those one isolated examples don't mean we should hurt all trans people by kicking them out of bathrooms. So what you can say is, and this is something that there's some language I'll send you from law enforcement, there has been no increase in incidents. And this is sort of, can drift into sort of obnoxious politician language, and I apologize for that. But what that means is, in no place where there are trans-inclusive laws has there suddenly been an influx of people pretending to be trans or actual trans people harassing people in bathrooms. And so while there might, and I don't agree that there are, but while our opponents might say there are some isolated incidents, that is not a trend. That is not an increase in public safety incidences, and that is not a good basis for public policy. And I hope that helps. It's frustrating because we want to be able to say there's never been an incident. I firmly believe as an individual that there hasn't been an incident, but even if there is an incident tomorrow, this is still the right thing to do. Protecting trans people goes hand in hand with protecting women and children. So thinking about those uncomfortable personal questions, what I mean by that is if someone asks me, have I had surgery? Or if someone asks you, is your child, has your child on hormones? There are three ways that I would say you can answer that. The first one is to deflect entirely. And what I mean by that is I'm actually not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about trans rights. So if I was doing an interview about non-discrimination laws, and a reporter asked me, have I had surgery? I might say, well, actually, I'm here to talk about non-discrimination laws, and whether or not I've had surgery shouldn't matter for whether or not I'm protected. And so I'm deflecting that question. I'm answering about the topic, not about myself. You can also give a partial response. So you can, and what I mean by that is you can answer for the community rather than yourself. If someone asks if I've had surgery, I might say, well, that's a personal question. Some trans people do have surgery and some trans people don't. And it's important to support everyone. So again, I'm answering a broader question about how trans people transition, but I'm not answering for myself. And the last one is giving that full response. So yes, I've had surgery. And I would say this is all about context. If I meet a new friend and we're talking about ourselves and talking about our identity and talking about our history and where we came from, we may both be sharing really personal things, including things about sex and sexuality and surgery. If I'm talking to a reporter, that might be not appropriate. And if I'm talking to a boss or a coworker, it might be really inappropriate. So giving the example of, is your child on hormones? The deflection would be, actually, I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to discuss supporting transgender students. So you're shutting that down. You're saying that is a personal issue. It's something that I'm not willing to talk about here, and you're setting a limit. The next one would be, well, some trans people blank while others blank. So you might say, some transgender children do go on hormones. Other transgender children don't. That's a personal decision, and I'd love to talk more about trans rights in schools. And then fully answering that, is your child on hormones? She is, in fact, and then you could go into talking about that. There is not one right way to handle these, which is why I sort of like thinking about it in this way of how much do I want to engage? Do I want to fully answer that question, answer it as a community question, or shut it down because it's not what we're talking about right now? All right. Any other questions, and I'm going to unmute stuff, any other questions before we finally shift into specifically talking about schools and state advocacy? Oh, and before I forget, one of my favorite ways to kill time in an interview is to take sips of water. So if someone asks you that tough question, by all means, oh, that's a great question. Buy yourself some time by having a drink. All right, school level advocacy. So I want to go over some general things that everyone can do, and then I'm going to talk specifically about when schools are or aren't supportive, what that means. So in general, I would say first and foremost, remember to engage trans people in the work that you're doing, particularly trans youth. Because what trans youth are experiencing in one school may be very different than what trans youth are experiencing in another school, excuse me, even if both of those schools are in the same district or both of those districts are in the same state. And so you want to make sure when you're advocating with the trans community, you're mindful of what that community needs. This can be a little fuzzier with real young kids because they don't have the ability to self-advocate quite in the same way yet. But at the very least, making sure you aren't going in and speaking on behalf of a community that already has some priorities in order and that you're not reordering those. To use a really specific example, at some college campuses, there may be gender-neutral housing already that has nothing to do with trans kids. And so students on that campus might say, well, what we really need is to be able to update our IDs and update our school records to reflect who we are. Another college campus may have a really easy policy for changing IDs, but might not have gender-neutral housing, and so that campus might have different needs. Similarly, one school might have great policies, but the teachers aren't following them, so that's the thing to deal with, where another school might have amazing teachers even though they don't have an official policy. So working with those teachers to create that policy is going to be the way to go. There's a question, does NCTE offer slide presentations to present to the school to help educate? That's an awesome idea. I love that. I'm going to write that down. So slide decks for folks to advocate in schools. I love that idea, and can't promise it'll happen right away, but it certainly seems like a resource that we can put together, and I would certainly love thoughts and input. And someone is saying that GLSEN might. Christina, if you're, or Christiane, I'm sorry, if you're able to follow up with that GLSEN resource, I would love to share that with people. And if anyone else has resources, please let me know. So something I also like to think about, and this is something I know, for example, the Illinois Safe Schools Alliance in Illinois talks about, is the carrot and stick. And the carrot is talking to those teachers and those educators about the higher ideals of education, that you want to make sure all of your students are being educated. And then the stick, unfortunately, is the threat of lawsuits sometimes, and making sure that when you're communicating with schools, you have both of those in mind, that there can be an appeal to those higher ideals of education, and also reminding schools that they have legal obligations. All right, a couple of things came in the chat box, so I want to follow up on those. My trans child is beginning high school next year, and they're encouraging them using the nurse's room. How do I request other options since the school is large and it's not feasible to always get to the nurse without losing instruction time? Not sure how hard to push or what I can legally push for. I'd like for my child to have the option to use any restroom available, but definitely don't want to have to run to a restroom in time. Absolutely. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. In general, I would say that other schools are saying that is not a best practice. So you can say other schools are agreeing, and I'll send examples of this, around the country, that requiring my child to use a different bathroom is not an acceptable solution. Offering it as an option is totally okay. Saying if you would prefer to use this private bathroom, that's fine, as long as it is actually an option and not an option in air quotes, where it's technically I'm offering you this, but really it's something you have to do. And in terms of legal pushing, I want to follow up legal push against bathroom. My understanding as a non-lawyer is that courts have been finding that that would violate Title IX to require that, but that's part of what Gavin Grimm's case is about and what will be heard in the Supreme Court later this month, is the idea that that definitely does violate Title IX. So we might have some better federal answers for that in the next couple of months. There might also be state laws that protect, and that's something that if you follow up with me about what state you're in, we can definitely look into together. Someone else said, as a parent of the only known trans student at my daughter's school, I feel like the admin will take my request for staff training with a grain of salt. How can I convince this will benefit more than just my own child? Awesome question. So part of it is reminding them that she is the only out trans student. That doesn't mean there aren't others, and it doesn't mean there won't be more soon. The other thing is that there are studies that have shown that the majority of kids who are bullied around anti-LGBT teasing do not identify as LGBT. And in particular, there was a study that showed that 3 out of every 4 kids who is teased for being gay does not themselves identify as gay. And so simply saying we don't have any trans students here doesn't mean that there isn't bullying that's happening around gender and expression, and doesn't mean that teachers don't need that equipment and that language and those resources for that training. So as much as your child might be a catalyst for training, the training is absolutely about more than just your child. Another question, anyone has a template to send to school boards requesting they make a public statement in support of youth? That's an awesome question. Request for public statement. And that's something I'd love to see if parents are able to share with each other. I will also happily share stuff out. So the question was if anyone has a template for how to ask school boards that they make a public statement supporting LGBTQ youth. I don't think NCTE has anything like that, but I will definitely ask around. And also, if parents have stuff that they've come up with, I would certainly share that and be happy to share that out either with or without your identifying info. Another question, we're in an elementary level, so the school is concerned about upsetting and or introducing a topic that they aren't comfortable with. This is where I would go back to the carrot and stick. That the carrot there is, yeah, it can be uncomfortable. It is still our responsibility as educators to make sure that all of the students in our school are protected and have a safe and happy learning environment. And the stick, and again, only you know if this is appropriate based on your relationship with that school, is that this needs to happen. It needs to happen to support my child or whomever your child is. It needs to happen to support this community, and it needs to happen because courts are siding with this more and more. So I would say the lack of comfort argument that this is going to be squicky, that goes back to validating that. Absolutely, this can be uncomfortable. Absolutely, this can be difficult. And absolutely, I want to work with you to make it more comfortable and less difficult. But simply it being hard is not an excuse for a school to avoid it. And with that in mind, here is a rat holding what looks like a little Easter egg. Because cuteness comes in all forms, and sometimes cute things are very small. All right. So thinking about how to advocate for your school or your district, I want to talk a little bit about what a model policy might look like. And this, GLSEN has put together some really great stuff, and I'll send this out. So I'm going to go through this a little fast because GLSEN has put together a wonderful document around it. So the first thing is, a model policy in a school that supports trans students should cover everything. It should cover the students. It should cover the teachers. It should cover extracurriculars. It should cover the language being used in documents and how schools are talking to the public about things. So for a truly comprehensive trans inclusive policy, the school really needs to think top to bottom and front to back of how all of those things are going to be covered. In particular, we would want to see a model policy talk about bullying and harassment to make sure that anti-trans or anti-LGBT bullying is explicitly said as something that's not acceptable. We would want to think about privacy and confidentiality. If a student comes out to a teacher, what does that mean? We would argue that that is not something teachers should be mandated to report, and that in fact that betrays confidence. So that a child coming out to their teacher or a student coming out to their teacher should be kept private and confidential unless there's a compelling health reason or safety reason not to. And simply that child being trans is not a health or safety reason to report it. A policy should also cover media and community communication, meaning that when that school talks to the public, they should be doing so in a way that includes their trans students. And this might be as simple as changing language from boys and girls, and it might be as complicated as making sure that when there are statements around LGBT History Month or the Day of Silence or any other things, trans people are being included. We also want to see model policies that deal with names and pronouns in school records. And what this means is that someone should not need to have a legal name change for their names to be updated in school records. Someone should not have to have undergone any surgery or medical care for the teachers to change their pronouns, and that there should be a way for students and parents to change those school records so that they reflect who that child is. Now, some schools might have requirements for having records that match legal documents, and that's okay. If a school says we need to have oh, now I'm being told my audio is being degraded, so I apologize if folks are having audio questions. We would say it's okay if the school needs to have language that reflects that child's legal name, but the attendance sheet in the classroom should be able to reflect who that child is rather than the child's legal name. We would also say access to gender segregated activities and facilities. This is the one that is most often the sticking point, and this is the bathroom thing that everyone talks about. But in our perfect model policy, this would be included. Same with dress code. And then the last thing a perfect model policy would include is resources for what it means for a student to transition at school and how parents can support that. Again, the GLSEN policy goes into real great detail on all of these, and I'll send that. Some other things to think about for putting together a model policy is making sure there's time for community engagement and conversation. This can be really scary because this opens up a platform for parents or for community members who are not okay with trans rights to have their voice heard. And what I would encourage you to think about is, if at all possible, and I know this isn't always possible, to get the school on board so that they can help steer that conversation. So if parents are coming to school board meetings and are pushing back, members of the school administration and educators and people on the PTA are prepared for that and are able to respond in ways that takes those concerns seriously, but also doesn't back down from supporting trans rights. Similarly, an ideal model policy should have space for professional development and make sure that teachers, educators, administrators, nurses, gym teachers are able to learn how this is going to affect them. And the last thing I would say is a policy needs to have teeth. It needs to have consequences for not living up to the policy, and it needs to be really clear both to students and to staff that this policy is being taken seriously, and not living up to it is going to be a problem. So what does that mean in practice? Well, regardless of where you are, there are some things you can definitely do. You can continue to educate your community. And what I mean by that is you can link up with allies, you can find opportunities to meet up, teach and give resources, and repeat that. You can, regardless of what state you're in and regardless of how supportive your district is, I promise you there are going to be people who are on your side, and taking that baby step of connecting with them and starting to share resources is a great first step anywhere. I would also say that school districts may be able to do better even if there aren't supportive state level policies. And individual schools might be able to do better even if there aren't district level policies. So if there are roadblocks, that doesn't mean that it's hopeless or that there aren't good things you can still do. And then I always want to connect with folks. I really appreciate your willingness all to engage in sort of this new steps that we're working to support parents and support trans youth better. So I would say continue to connect with NCTE, continuing to connect with each other. We are hoping soon to provide some space for parents and advocates for trans youth to be able to connect more online and share resources with each other, and I'll keep you all in a loop about that as we move forward. In support of districts, there are a couple of things that you can still do. One would be to thank educators and administrators, and this is something that can go hand in hand with encouraging them to speak out. So making sure if your school has good policies, if your district has good policies, if your state has good laws, thank them. And that's something that can feel sort of like you're yelling into an echo chamber, but is really important. Politicians and legislators and teachers and administrators want to hear that what they're doing is the right thing. And continue to speak out at city council meetings and school board meetings and by writing letters to the editor and by posting on social media so that people remember this is what's happening and that people are aware our community supports this. And similarly, and I love that someone already brought this up, push school boards or school districts or politicians to make statements so that it is clear that they are, not only were they on your side a couple years ago when they voted on this, but they're still on your side. And I would also say thinking outside of your school. Are there other organizations that work with youth, whether it's the YMCA or Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, that your child is involved in or your child's friends are involved in that you can connect with to make sure they also are supporting trans and gender nonconforming youth? And I would say with all of that, that not being complacent, that remembering to continue to beat the drums and remembering that simply putting in place a policy doesn't mean that that policy is being followed, not always intentionally. Sometimes educators just aren't aware of it. And so making sure that you are continuing to check in, even if something last year was working great, making sure it's still working great this year. For districts that are more in the middle, and this might mean they have a policy that's good in some places or not in others, or that might mean they don't have any policies, either supportive or not supportive of trans students, continuing to push for those policies and continuing to find your allies. So this is something that's very similar, making sure that you are going to speak at those school board meetings and write those letters to the editor and connect with politicians in your area so that those districts and those schools that aren't sure, that are in that movable space in the middle of they haven't come out explicitly supporting trans youth, but they also haven't come out explicitly hurting trans youth, that you can get in there and make your voice heard now. For districts that are unsupportive, and this might be districts that you've tried to get stuff passed and they've said no, or districts that have explicitly passed stuff that hurts trans students, or in states like North Carolina where there are state level laws that hurt trans students. The first thing I would say is thinking about how do you talk about that. And there are a couple of phrases that can be helpful. That they are on the wrong side of the law. Even in places like North Carolina where they've changed the law, we are saying that still violates Title IX and still violates the student's ability to have a good and positive education. And they're also on the wrong side of what's right. And this goes back to that idea of the carrot and the stick, of failing to live up to those ideals of education, failing to live up to those ideals of supporting all students and all communities. And thinking about what that means as an educator and what that means as an administrator, to be able to look someone in the eye and say, I know you want to support every single one of your students, and you're not right now. In unsupportive districts, it is particularly important to find those allies, either other parents and families, or online through NCTE or elsewhere, or in the district and in the administration, and making sure that you have each other's backs so that you're not going to speak at a school board meeting or to speak at a community council meeting alone. But please do continue to speak. Speaking out about trans youth and speaking out about being a family of a trans person is one of the most powerful ways to impact change, to impart change. And as we saw in North Carolina, as we're starting to see in Texas, as we're seeing in other places across the country, telling our stories can have a huge impact. And in places like South Dakota, where there was an anti-trans bill and the governor was able to meet with trans people and hear their stories, the governor ultimately vetoed that bill. Whereas in places like North Carolina, where former Governor McCrory did not meet with any trans students, even though we and other organizations tried for months to get him to meet with trans students, he didn't. And clearly Governor McCrory was not interested in engaging with the trans community. A couple of specific talking points. And these, again, I'm going to email out. Over 40% of K-12 students already attend schools with affirming state or local policies, and that number is growing rapidly. So when we're talking about this, we're not talking about something that is new. We're not talking about something that is untested or untried. We were talking about something that almost half of the K-12 students are already in places that support trans students, and that number is continuing to grow. And that supporting trans students in this way is backed by tons of professional organizations. I'm going to read off a bunch right now. I'll send you the list later because I love having this list in my pocket. Among the organizations that have supported trans students and support these types of policies, the American Association of Secondary School Principals, the National Association of Elementary School Principals, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the National Association of School Psychologists, the American School Counselors Association, the National Parent-Teacher Association, the National Education Association, and the American Federation of Teachers. And again, I'll send you out that list, but it can be really powerful to say, this is not just me saying this, this is all of these professional organizations of teachers saying this is the right thing to do. It's also helpful to sometimes note that research has our backs too. When trans students are supported and affirmed, they thrive and succeed at the same rates of other students. When they are not supported and affirmed, they have worse outcomes across the board. They do worse at school, they have worse health outcomes, they are less likely to graduate, they are more likely to be homeless, all of those other things. And as a link to that, trans youth have greater mental health challenges because of those hostile environments. And so creating a less hostile environment is critically, critically important. I want to pause for a moment to see if there are any questions or any additions, because I also don't want to pretend that I have all of the answers or all of the talking points. So if you've seen something that particularly worked well, if you have an experience that you have a question about how to advocate better, I want to take a couple minutes to give a chance for people to either share thoughts about what's worked, what hasn't worked, or questions that they're hoping to get answered. And I'm going to give people a couple minutes. I know some are typing. I've tried to unmute people if you do want to share a question that way.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
We can.
I wrote a couple of things in the chat about advice on how to respond to people that say this is a political issue and my opinions need to be respected. But just to clarify, if schools are concerned about being too open about it or too accepting because they don't want to feel like they're, you know, being too one-sided because they want to appear neutral, what are some ways to kind of steer it back to a issue just about basic human needs and not about politics or left or right?
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely. I'm writing that question down because that's part of the reason I love doing conversations like these is because you tell me so much that I don't know as someone who's not a parent. And so I love learning that that's a concern schools have, because that's really helpful for us to know. My gut reaction, and I also want to see if other parents or educators or advocates have thoughts on how to respond to that. My gut reaction is making sure that every student, including my trans student, is supported and affirmed, is not asking you to be anything other than a neutral school to support every one of your students. That the way we do that might require some conversation and might require some discussion and learning and growth, and that learning and growth can be hard and difficult. But at the end of the day, you are mandated as a school, both morally and legally, to support all of your students. And even if it's one student, and I guarantee there are more who aren't out or there are more who are going to be there next year, if you're failing to live up to that, then that's a problem. I'm curious what other parents think and how other educators or advocates have engaged in that. And again, making sure I'm understanding, Emily, the question was how to respond for schools that say, well, we want to stay neutral or we don't want to get into what feels like a political issue around supporting trans students. Has anyone else encountered that? Anyone have things that they feel like have worked or not?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I would just kind of argue the point that they don't have to change policy or to institute policy doesn't mean that they have to make it, you know, a big deal. That they have. I think that's what I'm hearing is that they want to stay neutral and not offend anybody. But they don't have to announce everything they're doing, and that's how I've kind of thought that is saying that they, you know, nobody's asking them to make a banner and put it on Facebook or anything, just to make the actual changes. And you know, to me that just says they're living in fear of one parent being upset. I mean, that could go against any policy they do. So I think that's just kind of a personal school official kind of issue dealing with whatever their fear is and why that seems to be on their mind, kind of dealing with that further.
I think that's a great response. And I definitely would agree that sometimes saying, if we can get this passed, we are not going to go to the local paper and say, yay, look what happened. That can be a double-edged sword because 6 months down the road, another parent who's against trans rights might find out and might be even angrier that it wasn't publicly announced. So I would want to be careful with that. But I absolutely agree that sometimes discretion and saying we want to make sure this happens and it's more important that my child is protected than that we win a public fight on the front page of the paper, that can definitely help. Any other thoughts on that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. So I'm a parent of a trans child, and I'm also an educator who had a child transition in my classroom. So I've experienced this from many different sides, but one of the big barriers for my school that I taught in was, can we talk about this at the elementary school level? Because this is really maybe should be more of like a middle school or a high school thing. And one way that I helped to reassure them that it wasn't inappropriate to talk about it was because a lot of people had the misunderstanding that it was about sexuality. And so just reminding them that we talk about gender all the time in our classrooms. We say boys and girls. We do all kinds of things that talk about gender, and this is just another facet of what we're already talking about, and just another kind of branch in terms of the policies of our particular school that encompasses something that's already part of our daily life.
Absolutely.
So kind of bringing it into the fold of what we're used to and not having it be this big foreign object that we were bringing in, and that was helpful.
And that reminds me, I'll send in the follow-up email. There's a great documentary called It's Perfectly, no, that's not what it's called. It's Elementary, that's what it is. There's a documentary called It's Elementary, and it was a conversation with elementary school students about what it means to be gay, and showed really beautifully how it is possible to have a conversation with adolescent students, prepubescent students, and this is specifically around sexuality, but the point seems like a really easy parallel. And they did a follow-up a decade later, it's still elementary, and those students who had what many schools would consider too young, big air quotes around that, conversations around sexuality were absolutely fine as young adults. The only difference was they were less likely to be homophobic. And so documentaries and resources like that are also a great way to acknowledge that. I would also say, putting my educator hat on for a moment, if a student has a question about it or if a student has a concern about it, then they're not too young to talk about it. I don't know that that's official good public policy from a district level standpoint, but from an emotional standpoint, I feel like if a child has a question about something, saying you're too young is never the right answer. But maybe that's me being my radical educator self. Any other thoughts before we move on?
I was just going to say something about our transition in elementary school. I'm from a district that does have comprehensive guidelines for the rights of transgender youth. And that has been very helpful. And I had a new principal. We had 4 weeks to transition my son before school. And he pretty much left it up to me. And we went around and around about sending a letter or telling parents. And in the end, what we did is we just went to school and the teacher made an announcement and said, this is, Jonah, and you knew him as a different name last year, and now this is his name, and that was it. And we got nothing back, no backlash. And I think we kind of came to the agreement of the less fanfare, the better. And if a parent came to the principal, I never heard of it because the principal would say, I'm going to protect your child's personal information, and I'm going to protect all children's personal information, and shut it down. So that was his reassurance to me that it's nobody's business.
That's wonderful, and sounds like it was a really great ally and advocate. And I think for those of us who either have or have worked with young kids, kids take their cues from adults. And if an adult says this is the way it is, then that's the way it is. I remember explaining to a cousin of mine, and she said, so you used to be a boy. She was maybe 4 or 5, and so hadn't remembered me before I transitioned. And I said, yeah, I used to be a boy, which is not the perfect language. It's not language I love, but for a 4-year-old, I'm willing to make some concessions. And her response was, okay, can I show you my butterfly house? Because if we treat it as not a big deal as adults, then kids are able to pick up on that. I want to talk a little bit about some larger state level advocacy, although please keep these questions and thoughts coming. So the first thing is I want to give you a little bit of info about the lay of the land. So there are 14 states, and I'll send this list as a follow-up, that have explicit trans-supportive state-level education guidance. There are other states that have non-discrimination laws or policies that do also protect trans students, even if they aren't explicitly about students. So for example, and I know this having grown up in Illinois, Illinois has non-discrimination stuff that covers gender and gender identity and sexuality. It's not on that list of 14 states, but there are still protections in Illinois because the protections aren't specifically about education. A lot of states then have no policies one way or the other, so it's not clear from a state level what responsibilities they have for trans students. Now again, we would say Title IX unambiguously protects trans students. That word unambiguously is tricky though, because there are those who would say no, 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 it doesn't, so maybe there is a little ambiguity. And then some states, in particular North Carolina, have explicitly anti-trans laws or policies. And sort of like we talked about with the schools, I'm going to talk about what actions can be taken in supportive states, what actions can be taken in those states where it's sort of unclear, and what actions can be taken in those states where there isn't that protection. So in supportive states, and this is going to sound familiar, continuing to share your stories. We always love helping with letters to the editor or writing op-eds or getting out YouTube videos or whatever you feel safe and appropriate for your family, because there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but sharing your story absolutely can make a difference. And then similarly, and I love the brainstorming we've already done about this, calling for those public statements for others to support trans students. And this can be literally any organization that feels appropriate. So that can be your local school district, that can be your local paper. There have been some really wonderful editorials that the Chicago Sun-Times and others have put out saying, as a paper, this is the right thing, we are saying this is the right thing to do. And then making sure those schools, districts, and states hold to their policies, that if there are supportive policies, are they actually implemented? Are they being backed up by resources? And then networking engaging is also something that's incredibly valuable and important. And I would say this is both true so that you can have each other's backs in those states where there is support, and so you can connect with parents and families in places where there isn't as much support. One of the things that has been incredibly satisfying and rewarding about this job is moments like this where I'm able to connect with parents and educators and help them connect to give each other resources. In places where there isn't clear protection, again, pushing those elected officials. So making sure that at the state level, you know who your state representatives are or your state senators are, and you know who your mayor is and your city council folks, and how you can push them and meet with them to make sure that trans rights are at the very least on their radar and hopefully become a cause that they can really support. And then again, cities and school districts may be able to implement change even if at the state level it doesn't feel realistic. So seeing if your state doesn't feel like it's going to pass something that supports trans students anytime soon, can your city or can your school district? And again, that networking and engaging. And in those places that are explicitly unsupportive, continue to push those elected officials. Again, some cities and school districts may be able to implement change and continue to network and engage. And the last but not least, and this is something that as someone who's not a lawyer, I'm not recommending anyone specifically do, but an option on the table is looking into lawsuits. That courts are still siding with trans students more than not, and that if you feel the situation in your school or in your district or in your state is so problematic and so untenable, looking into lawsuits is something that you can always do. That isn't something that NCTE directly does, and what I mean by that is our lawyers won't go to court with you, but we can absolutely connect you and provide resources if you are looking at that option. And what I mean by resources is really, we can give you folks that you would need to reach out and contact. We don't have the capacity to sort of directly do legal representation or support. I think we've already brainstormed through this, but I want to make sure to give some time. Are there any other thoughts, either questions or brainstorming, on state level advocacy and how that might be different than school or district level advocacy?
I would just say that if you advocate for any other group, like I just happen to be involved with health policy legislation, you know, if you're already there advocating for something, there is a way to always kind of tie this in. And so you're already maybe supported by a group or have a different issue. While you're face to face with them, you can tie this in. I mean, I do a lot of health policy advocating, and so I bring this up frequently only because I'm in pediatrics, and so this is a segue for me. So that's just one way to advocate without getting a meeting for transgender issues, which they may not want to do. But if you are there for a different reason, you can always bring this up.
I love that, and I would also expand it a teeny bit to also say other organizations you're involved in that may not be explicitly advocacy. Are you in a religious community? Are you in a religious community, and do they have a position on this? Does your job have any sort of political arm or policies that might somehow impact trans young people? And I love the idea of being mindful that when you are advocating on other issues, linking those to trans rights as well. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. Other thoughts or questions or comments? All right. So I want to talk a little bit about what's next as we sort of wrap up. The first thing I want to remind is about self-care. And I'm going to introduce you to Dr. McSnuggles. And I honestly don't know in this photo if the doctor is the cat or the dog, but maybe they're both doctors. And I want to take a moment to brainstorm a little bit about what self-care means, because this work is hard, it is draining, and it is ongoing. And I want to explicitly give you permission to take care of yourself. And that might mean to not go to that rally that you're really excited about because you actually need to get some sleep, or to not speak at that city council meeting because you just spoke at one and it was really scary and hard, or to not speak to that reporter because, and this is something I connected with someone about earlier this week, because you have to take your kid to the doctor. Those are all really important reasons and really important things to do. Any other brainstorming or any other thoughts that people have found for self-care that was surprising to you? I know a lot of the stuff we talk about of connecting with community and of getting enough sleep and of eating well, all of that sort of self-care stuff is really easy to say and is a lot harder to do. So if there are any other thoughts on self-care, I would certainly love to hear them.
I often feel guilty because I have friends who are super active and out there, and that's not what's right for everyone in my family. My husband's less comfortable with it, and so I find just being gentle with myself about that, and just knowing that I'm going to do what I can do while taking care of myself and my other relationships with my family members. And that, it's not like a competition of who can be the best advocate.
I would totally agree, and I would remind people that the depictions they see of people on Facebook are curated and carefully selected. That simply because someone is posting that they're going to every single rally doesn't mean that they're actually having a good time or that they're able to sustain that. Any other thoughts on self-care? One thing I would say is really important is thinking about afterwards. So after that PTA meeting or after that city council meeting. A lot of the times we talk about preparation and not as much about support afterwards. So making sure you have people there who are going to have your back and be able to celebrate if you win and be able to commiserate if it doesn't go the way you wanted it to. All right. I also want to talk a little bit about the what ifs, and these can be the scary what ifs, but I want to make sure we at least touch on them. So what if something bad happens? What if there's a negative bill or a negative law? What if my child is targeted or bullied? The first thing I would say is make sure to take care of your family. And if that means getting off of Facebook for a while, if that means no longer doing interviews or media the way that you have been, if that means trying to shift around what resources you have to support your kid, and continuing to connect with each other. So I would say making sure that if you are having negative experiences or if something is really draining emotionally, leaning on each other and being able to commiserate as parents and fellow educators and fellow advocates, so that you are able to connect with that community, even if that community isn't down the street. Even if you're feeling isolated in your geographic area, there are absolutely people who still are up for connecting with you. I would also say consider engaging with media, that if something negative happens to you or happens to your family or happens to your trans child or the young trans person that you're connected with, it is an option to try and get that story out in the media. I'm always happy to brainstorm about that. I don't want to pretend that's going to be the right solution for everyone. And I also can't guarantee that we can get you media coverage, but it's certainly something to consider. And I would definitely say I'm always happy to talk and brainstorm and connect with other resources. So please do feel free to reach out to NCTE. And then there are other organizations that are supporting trans students that might have more explicit legal resources or explicit mental health resources. And so if you're looking for that, please do either reach out to NCTE and we'll see if we can point you in the other direction, or there is a long list of acronyms and letters of these various organizations that are helping trans students and working to help trans students. There's more news that's coming out soon. So as someone mentioned earlier, there was a federal district court judge in the Pittsburgh suburbs, I believe, that said the school district there will allow students to use the bathroom that matches who they are. That's great. And that is the type of precedent and type of continued case and coverage that we hope to see more of. Gavin Grimm's case and the hearings will be on March 28th, and there's already some rallies and support of Gavin planned for then. And we are expecting that the ruling will be sometime in June. There are other lawsuits around the country, the Pennsylvania one. Then there are others that may have been put on pause awaiting Gavin Grimm's case, so we're hoping for some more news around that as that case goes. We're continuing to work around coalition building, and this is something that NCTE is hoping for your help with, and I'm going to follow up in the days and weeks to come about what tools we're hoping to use for that and how we want to help connect y'all so that some of this resourcing and brainstorming we can help facilitate and also let y'all connect with each other. And then there are protests around the country, being mindful of what's happening in your community, and if you want to help plan or stage something in your community. On June 11th, there is the plan for the National Pride March. This was coming in sort of the heels of the Women's March. It's still sort of unclear exactly how that's going to come together and what that's going to look like, but certainly if you're in the DC area and if you're looking for an excuse to make a trip to DC when it's miserably hot, the Pride March on June 11th should be something pretty cool. I'm not totally sure how it's going to come together, but it looks like it'll be at least a lot of awesome people advocating together. In terms of NCTE plans moving forward, we absolutely want to have more workshops like these. If there are things you felt, and I took some great notes on questions that came up, if there are things you felt like were missing from this workshop or are other topics you'd like to see covered, please, please, please let me know, and I'll see what we can do. We're working on coalition with other organizations, so making sure that we are working with the ACLU and are working with the NAACP and with Lambda Legal and with all of these other organizations. And NCTE wants to work more on getting out resources so that community members like yourself can continue to talk about these issues. So I'm going to send some of that today. That's not true. I'm going to send some of that later this week, and we'll continue to build that out. So if there are specific questions you get that you want help answering, others are probably getting those questions too, and I'm always happy to help brainstorm how to best answer those. We also want to do more work to stay connected, and that's something with the coalition work as well. So stay tuned, please, on what we're going to be doing with that. In terms of final steps, some of you have already shared your stories with our Share Your Story form. It's in the upper right of our website, and that plugs you in to our database that we're building out that we draw from when we connect with advocates, when we connect with legislators, when we connect with media. And if you are in particular interested in sharing your story with media or in brainstorming about that, please feel free to shoot an email, and I will let some time for questions or thoughts. Please feel free to shoot me an email, and I can tell you a little bit more about that. Talking with me never means you have to talk to media. So if you are curious about that, we can definitely set up a phone call. We have a couple minutes left. So if there are any final questions, thoughts, comments, things you feel like were really helpful, things you feel like we're missing, and I appreciate you taking some time out of your day. All right. Well, thank you all again for taking the time. I am going to share the video of this webinar, which will be the slides and us talking about it. I'll also share the slide deck itself. And I have a bunch of questions that I love that I will try and answer as many as I can in the follow-up email, as well as some of the resources we talked about from GLSEN, from documentaries, and from elsewhere. I want to thank everyone for being able to attend to this, and please do look for that email later this week. Thanks again, and please do continue advocating. Having parent and educator and family voices is incredibly important. So keep up the good work, and I will talk to you all soon.